I've often heard people say that Descartes supposedly introduced the subject-object split into Western thought, the distinction between me, the subject, and the world out there as an object that I can manipulate and submit to my own will. And supposedly he was co-responsible for today's meaning crisis. Supposedly he was responsible for the rise of Western science and Western materialism, where everything is treated in terms of objecthood and something that can be mathematically modeled. And supposedly this is at the heart of us not only today not being able to make sense of reality anymore, and using and abusing nature in our own interests, but it's also at the heart of us feeling a void of disconnectedness from the world, a disconnectedness from other people when we treat them as objects, and being at the heart of the meaning crisis. I'm not sure I agree with this reading of Descartes, and not because I care about Descartes, but I think it misunderstands and misreads the nature of the meaning crisis itself, and therefore the solutions that people come up with. This is not about Descartes, but this is about how we understand the meaning crisis and what we think we can do about it. Now, I've always found very puzzling that if you look at what is the strongest counter-discipline, what is the strongest antidote to materialism, which discipline is it? It's phenomenology. It's the first-person discipline, the strongest antidote that you can have, together with Kantianism, right? And if you look at the founders of those schools, Kantianism and phenomenology, who were they most influenced by? I think you could argue Husserl and Stein and Sartre were significantly influenced by Descartes. So isn't it weird? I know with physicists we know, right? When you ask physicists about some of their founding fathers, you will hear about Newton and you will hear about Descartes. It's obvious that Descartes is an influence. But I'm not sure people are really aware that the same thing is true if you ask people about phenomenology. Who is a major founding father for phenomenology? It's Leibniz and it's Descartes. It's weird. Descartes manages to give birth to both antidotes, schools that come many years after his death. And this always struck me as a bit odd, and always seemed to imply that either people are totally misreading Descartes, or ignoring parts of Descartes that other people are picking up, or those founding fathers of phenomenology and mothers just didn't read Descartes, had a very wrong conception of Descartes, and came up with their own interpretations of Descartes that just don't make sense. However this might be, I think it's worth to just look at our understanding of what the subject-object split actually means. Now, supposedly, what was prior to Descartes, pre-modernity, was an enchanted world, a world where the self and the world were not distinguished, a world which was full of subjects, where the world was treated as an extension of yourself, and where you're not just bumping into other objects, but everything is basically in touch with you and you're in touch with everything else. The enchanted pre-Cartesian world is one in which you're connected, supposedly, with everybody else, with your local community, and with everything else, including nature. Now, I'm a bit confused by this kind of reading of history, because if you just look at child development, children don't start out with a fusion between themselves and the world. This is a misconception that has been often quoted, but I think it has been shown by developmental psychologists like Dornes, for example, that the children start to make the distinction between themselves as a physical boundary and the world as a different from themselves very early on. I think even before the first year. Children are not embedded in a world where everybody else is connected to you, but a much more fitting interpretation is actually that the children are embedded in a world which is basically only a world of objects. Everything to the child is an object. In the sense, the first schemas and the first ways of grasping reality that we have available are in terms of something physical. And it's really interesting how fascinated children are with physical boundaries, and how fascinated they are with dealing with reality in its physical terms. In other words, by just looking at what does an object do. So they experiment, try to figure out what would happen if I do this to the object. What would happen if I would put it here, if I would put it somewhere else. They are almost obsessed with the physical properties of reality, stuff that we actually find boring as adults. To a child can be endlessly fascinating. And it's usually just extremely centered around the physical appearance of something. I mean, just look at toys. Toys, I mean, it's very obvious, are targeting this fascination of children with the physical appearance of something. I can even think back at times when I was really fascinated by the physical experience beyond anything else. And this is their world. Their world is one of starting to distinguish objects from each other, and basically treating everything there is around them as mere object, and their own subjectivity as the absolute center of everything else. In other words, they don't see themselves as subject. They don't see themselves as experiencing the world among other experiencers, but they rather see the world in terms of their own subjectivity. Their own subjectivity is there, but it's basically everywhere. Everything is a projection of their own subjectivity. And there are hints for this. One of the hints is that if you don't distinguish yourself from another self, from another subject, you don't see the boundaries of your own subjectivity, and therefore don't ask questions. That's how you start to understand that somebody is different from you, by asking meaningful questions, by probing into the alterity of the other person, by probing into how the other person experiences the world differently from how you experience the world. Children don't do this up until a certain age. They have to learn to first look at their own subjectivity and see their own subjectivity as different from the subjectivity of somebody else. This is not something that they start out with. And even in human history, if you look at pre-modernity, so pre-Cartesian history, what was one of the most dominating features is absolutist thought. And Rousseau made the point, an almost contemporary of Descartes, that what people are trying to do from this absolutist position is they are trying to elevate their own voice beyond everybody else's voice. So Rousseau made the point that when people say the Bible says, they're not noticing is what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to elevate their own voice by referencing an authority that supposedly is all binding to everybody, and thus making your own voice into the absolute authority. They're not noticing, as Rousseau said, that it is them saying what the Bible says, but they're just immediately stating the Bible says. What they're doing is they're attempting to absolutize their own perspective and their own experience and their own way of sensing the world. And this is what Descartes introduced. He didn't introduce the subject-object split. What he introduced was the becoming aware of yourself as a subject among other equal subjects. And that's a huge fall. That's, as an experience, as a child, this is a huge fall from grace, and it's like a second birth, because it's the realization is that just you are just another self among many other selves. Other selves which have a life as well. They have their own experiences. They have their own past. You might have had this experience when you go somewhere very impressive, where you are surrounded by very impressive historical buildings. And if you look around, every single brick that has been laid by someone, by an experiencing being, whose maybe entire life it was to lay a portion of that huge building. And that experience, there was a term for that. It's a pretty rough fall, for children particularly, when they fall from the all-encompassing, everything's just me, everything's just my world, into, hey, I'm just one among many. It is a pretty strong kick. And that's what Descartes introduced. And that's what inspired changes in many different disciplines. For example, the idea of positive law, that law is not just God-given and unchanging, but law has to always be adapted to our current understanding of ourselves, of who we think we are, of our own subjectivity. It is connected to our understanding of education. It's not something God-given, but it's something positive. It's something we can create and have to recreate from generation to generation. And it might be that we change law in such ways that it includes other living beings as well. But this is a result of learning. And this is a result of coordinating ourselves with others, and not just by proclaiming something to be true. Absolutist thinking, on the other hand, is proclaiming truths. It is not reasoning its truths, but it's just proclaiming them to everybody else, and everybody else has to submit themselves to it. What Descartes introduced into the picture, what he introduced was not in a world which was already enchanted, in a world where everybody experienced meaning, to separate and create a split between the observer and the observed. What he introduced was in a world that was a world of objects and object relationships, where people treated each other literally as objects, particularly if they were not of the same kind as you are. He introduced a notion that there are co-equal subjects out there. And this is at the heart of the idea of the human rights. Human rights assume a universalist idea that subjectivity or consciousness itself is not itself, if you want, relativistic, just one idea among many other possible ideas that you can have, but it's something that's binding, something that is at the foundation of every single culture. Every single culture is an expression of subjectivities, of conscious creatures. And that concept itself, the concept of consciousness itself, is not just a mere social construction. It's something that's real, and it's something that's, if you want, universally real and binding. And that's what Descartes introduced. The notion of subjecthood itself, with it, the notion of subjects having to be treated differently than objects. And you have to figure out, well, objects have to be understood. And how do you treat subject? What is it that subjects actually require you to do? Subjects, on the other hand, require you to not understand them in a physicalist way, but to recognize them. And this is an entirely different language that then has to be born around what you do with subjects, what you can do with subjects, and what you can't, which took a lot of time to actually be developed. And if you think about phenomenology, it's just barely more than 100 years old. It's a very, very recent discipline. Our understanding of subjectivity and how to treat subjectivity, if you look at educational science, for example, the stuff that we figured out in the past 100 years, that it might not be the best idea to, kick your children around, this is pretty recent stuff, because the thinking about subjectivity itself is a very recent phenomenon. To just simply ask the question, how could you experience something differently? And how could you do things differently? How would it affect your subjectivity? These are extremely recent questions. And all of them are inspired by the Cartesian introduction of subjectivity into the picture. It is also something that inspired hermeneutics, the idea that texts are not just given and have a meaning, but that you are co-creating meaning as a subject making sense of the text. That's what Descartes introduced. He introduced not into an already enchanted world a materialist frame, but he introduced into a power dynamic, into a picture which was mostly dominated by how you can relate to other objects. He introduced the notion that there is something that is not object-like, that is of entirely different nature, and it does not respond to being pushed around, but it responds to being asked questions. That's how you uncover subjectivity, by asking questions. That's also funny enough. a very recent phenomenon. The idea that asking questions is important. And that's how you get into a I-thou relationship, by asking questions. That's what I believe Descartes introduced into a world that was mostly navigated by what's pragmatically there for you as a being. I mean, it's the pre-Cartesian world is a world of immediate, if you want, relationship with just touching reality, just tossing and being tossed, particularly, around by reality and reacting to it. And Descartes was so convincing, not because he came up with an idea that nobody had thought of before, but simply because he was pointing out a way of relating to others that is just so damn evident. It's just so obvious that you can relate to other people by treating them as subjects, and it feels right. It feels very different from treating them as mere objects. The supposedly resulting meaning crisis, if you look at the solutions that people come up with, how can we overcome the meaning crisis? It is very, very telling that many of the suggestions are on the lines of we have to become more ritualistic, we have to become more collectivist, we have to go back to some kind of roots of doing things differently. Somehow, supposedly in the past, things were just working out, people didn't suffer from depression, and they were all connected with each other. The main point, which I believe many people, particularly in those circles, are overlooking, is that there wasn't a meaning crisis, and even today in many regions of the world, I believe there is no meaning crisis for many people, because they're mostly dominated by fear and by pain and by the necessity of surviving. And those experiences are stronger than any kind of ideology, no matter how screwed it might be and disorienting it might be. They are major forces providing you with a sense of purpose and with a sense of meaning in this life. And it's something that in our more humanitarian circles, people never really want to hear, is that maybe those factors and those experiences had a positive effect on many other people, which is to provide them with a sense of purpose and to have a regulatory function, if you want, on their emotions. When you are in a situation, I mean, even if you look at the animal world, this is something that I couldn't even see until 2 years ago or 3 years ago, because I was dominated so strongly by the idea that, hey, we have to just change the way you think about reality and everything will be fine. I couldn't even see the obvious that in the animal world, the dominating experience is fear. This is the first reaction that you get from a wild animal, fear. And fear has definitely, I mean, obviously, a regulatory function on human emotion. It's definitely something that guides emotion in not only deconstructive ways, which also, of course, exists, but mostly, actually, it is something that guides human emotion into constructive directions as well. And the reality, the pre-modern reality, actually is one where, if you think about it, and this is something that you can see even today in many regions of the world, ideology is not that important. Philosophers are just not that important, because what is important is your actual survival and your ability to make it actually through the day and having not much of a choice of how you spend your day. That pressure itself, being in that situation of pressure, this is something we don't want to admit, might ironically actually be providing people with a sense of purpose. So exactly the stuff that we don't want to do, we don't want to use force, you don't want to frighten people and tell them what to be afraid of. Exactly this stuff that was so horrible in the past, and we know it was horrible, and we know all the kind of trauma that it caused, ironically, might be exactly the stuff that made past generations and past cultures relatively stable. Exactly the stuff that we would never engage in today. And we think we have a solution for the meaning crisis on if you want, on a level of reflection about how to think about the world in different terms, and everything will just be fine. And I believe what we're totally overlooking is that we are basically in a social experiment here. We have no idea. We have no idea whether we'll be able to find a way which provides people with meaning, where you are in a world which is post-Cartesian, in the sense that you have to recognize the subjectivity of everybody else, and you have to accept that people are radically different from you. This is the challenge that Descartes brought to the table, and this is something that I never hear people mention. This is the challenge that he actually brought to the table, namely, how do you deal with the diversity of people around you? That people might have a different interpretation on very, very foundational experiences and on very foundational concepts of how to live your life. How will you deal with that? Pre-modernity doesn't even face the problem because everything is subjugated. Everything is following principles and rules that stand outside everybody else. You have to bow to the collective. Collectivist pre-modernity doesn't have the problem, but we naturally live in a time today where diversity is the starting point. And I don't think that you can solve this problem of diversity with intellectual abstractions and coming up with the new way of thinking about ourselves, being connected to everybody else. The idea of being connected to everybody else won't make people experience each other connected to everybody else, particularly to those who are different from you. This is something we have to solve on the ground by creating practices that solve the issue not on an intellectual level, but by bringing people who are actually diverse together in constructive ways. The way we did it in the past was leadership. You had someone who's in the top and inspires everybody to look across their differences. It was tradition, where everybody has to submit to the same tradition. But those approaches don't work anymore. I mean, it's unthinkable. They work for some people, and they can therefore punch far beyond their weight, if you want. Certain communities have chosen the way of almost cult-like appraisal of the leader. And it works for them, and they can punch way above their weight with following this strategy. But I believe for most people, this just won't work. It's just something that doesn't feel right. Submitting to tradition is the same thing. I think we can't expect everybody to become Christian. This just won't work. So in a sense, we are, if you think about it, clueless. We don't have a plan, we don't have a strategy. And we can't look back to history as an example because, again, where it went well in history, it was actually due and thanks to very, very dramatic circumstances that we don't want to see and don't want to admit. We don't want to admit that war has actually a regulatory function on human emotion, a positive one. It gives people direction. And we kind of don't want to do wars anymore. I mean, it can't be the solution that just because we kind of feel disoriented and don't know what to do with our lives, let's go to war to fix it. This just can't be the thing. And we are in this very, frightening situation that I believe nobody has a clue what we should do. And we can't learn from the past, and particularly by just changing the way we think about things, and by just changing a few rituals, you won't solve the fundamental problem that Descartes was pointing at. And that's coming about when you realize that you are one among many subjects, and all those subjects have their different subjectivity. How do you navigate that world without becoming insane, without losing yourself, without dominating others? How do you navigate that world? I don't think we have good answers, and the answers that I've seen so far are totally misreading the problem in the first place. So again, it's not about Descartes, but it's about we are totally misinterpreting the meaning crisis itself and suggesting solutions which are wishful thinking at best and deeply harmful, and oftentimes end up in very, very cult-like dynamics at worst.